Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the board and staff at IMFG, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's event on eco-fiscal tools and municipal finance, new practices and opportunities, with our speakers Jean-Philippe Meloche and Fanny Tremblay-Racicot, and our discussant Ben Dacus. I'd also like to welcome all of you who are joining us on live stream in the warmth and dryness of your wherever you are, but a especially warm welcome to those of you who turned up in the rain and to the right place. My name is Enid Slack, and I'm the director of the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance at the School of Cities here at U of T. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. First, some thank yous. I'd like to thank IMFG's external funders, Havana Capital, Maitrey, the City of Toronto, the Region of Halton, Region of Peel, Region of York, and Region of Durham. I'd like to thank our people at IMFG, Dina Grazer and Piali Roy, and also the staff at the Monk School for their help in organizing this event and for making it all run smoothly, as I know it will. And also before we begin, I'd like to introduce someone new to you, Kobad Kandan-Barani, who's our incoming Manager of Programs and Research, who's starting here on Monday. So welcome, Kobad, and if you have a moment at the end, do go and introduce yourself to him and say hello. If you're posting comments on LinkedIn or other social media platforms, and of course, we always encourage you to do that, our hashtag is IMFG Talks. Municipalities are affected by climate change in two major ways. On the one hand, they need to respond to extreme weather events, and we've seen many of these: floods, fires, hurricanes. But they also have an important role to play in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and meeting the national targets that have been set. Many municipalities are using what we call eco-fiscal tools. These are tax measures that use market price signals to encourage positive economic activity, such as job creation and investment, and at the same time reduce activities such as GHG emissions and pollution. Examples that you'll hear about are stormwater fees, congestion charges, parking levies, for example. So to talk about eco-fiscal tools, we have two speakers and a discussant. Jean-Philippe Meloche is a full professor at the School of Urban Planning and Landscape Architecture at the Université de Montréal, and also a visiting scholar here at IMFG. He is joined by Fanny Tremblay-Racicot, who is an associate professor in the Municipal and Regional Administration at the Graduate School of Public Administration and co-director of the Center for Research on Governance. Our discussant is well known to you, Ben Dacus. He is Vice President of Research and Outreach at Clean Prosperity. So our speakers will make their presentations. This will be followed by some comments from Ben, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for questions. So over to you.
Thank you, Enid. Thank you for inviting me as a visiting scholar at IMFG. I would like to thank also Fanny, as she agreed to work with me on that paper on eco-fiscal tools. We've been working on that subject for a few years, each on our sides, and it's the first time that we merge our work together in that paper. First of all, let's make a definition of what is eco-fiscal tools. We've chosen eco-fiscal because there was the Canada's Eco-Fiscal Commission a few years ago, and that's the word they used to talk about eco-fiscal tools. But if you go into the academic literature, most of the time you'll find environmental taxation, which is quite similar. Sometimes you'll have eco-taxation or ecological taxation, and less you'll have green taxation as well. So all those expressions means quite the same things, which means it's a levy, it's a tax that is usually taken upon something like pollution or bad behavior. The OECD got a definition that they called environmentally related tax, which is not necessarily a tax that was meant on purpose to target any pollution or bad behavior, but these are taxes on goods or services that do have an impact on the environment. And they do collect data on these types of taxes. And what you find mostly in these taxes is tax on energy or natural resources, for example. And since we work at the municipal level and the OECD, they just talk about taxes. And usually when you take environmental taxation, you talk about taxes as well. It's not necessarily including charges and fees. And if you look at municipal levels, we use lots of charges and fees that do have impact on the environment. So we decided to enlarge a little bit the definition, and we use a definition that's on the right here, which means any form of municipal levy, including taxes, fees, and charges, which is not included in OECD work, that has a direct or indirect impact on, indirect impact, which means that maybe it's not on purpose, just you tax something that will have an impact on the environment, or impact on a behavior or a pollutant that deteriorates the environment or result in the loss of natural resources. So that's the definition we use. And why should we use eco-fiscal tools? Well, the conceptual framework on which eco-fiscal tools are based, it's what we call the Pigouvian tax, which is a tax, environmental tax that was developed by Arthur Pigou in 1920. So it's more than 100 years ago. It's not necessarily a new style or a new kind of tax. It's very old. And what is the main benefits of eco-fiscal tools is what we call the double dividend. The double dividend is that if you tax a pollutant is an externality. Usually pollution are not included into prices, which means they are a distortion of markets. When you tax this type of distortion, not only you correct the distortion, which means that you will improve the environment, but you also have a tax that is more efficient than usual taxes. Why is it more efficient than usual taxes? Because all type of tax that you will levy on goods and services will bring a distortion on the market, which means consumer will pay a higher price than they should. Producer will have less revenue than they would want to have. And usually the amount of tax you collect on the market is less than the distortion you bring on the market, which means that you have what we call a deadweight loss on all market. If you tax on something that have externalities, then you correct this externality, which means that you don't have this deadweight on the market that you tax for if it's an environmental tax. That's why we think that the eco-fiscal tools are more efficient or more fiscally efficient than usual tools. So if you collect eco-fiscal tax, then or environmental tax, then you have a revenue to finance public services, less impact on markets, and you improve the environment, which is the double dividend. Of course, you don't necessarily use eco-fiscal tools for all environmental policies. Some policies you will probably like to use more coercive measures. If you have a very dangerous pollutant, then prohibit the pollutant. That's the more simple policy you use, and you stop this type of pollutant. If you have some bad behavior that are very easy to change, well, don't use eco-fiscal tools, because behavior is very easy to change. If you put any tax on the behavior will stop. Then you collect no money. it's better to use coercive measure for any behavior that are easy to change because the cost of coercive measure is low. You use eco-fiscal measure when you face a type of polluant or behavior that you cannot avoid, or it's too costly to avoid, but you don't want people to still have this behavior or produce the polluant free. You want a consequence. So it's free choice with constraint. That is where you use eco-fiscal tools, which means you have the right to pollute as long as you pay for that right. And if you can find this type of pollutant, then eco-fiscal tool will be very efficient. And carbon emissions is one example. Tomorrow morning, we cannot avoid to have carbon emissions. It's impossible. We're not elastic enough to change our behavior. But we don't want it to be free. We want a consequence if you emit any carbon emissions. So we use carbon tax, for example. That's a good place where we can use it. At the other end of the spectrum, you have the real free choice. You will use some communication tools, for example, if you want people to reduce the consumption of potable water. Spare the potable water, you do a communication campaign and you try to sensibilize people to the fact that you can miss water. Or you try to put some incentives so that people use the recycling bin. So you'll do a communication campaign, put your recycling in the recycling bin, please. And then people have the choice to do it or not. And why do we use communication tools if it's not that efficient? Well, the reason is because it's very cheap. Okay, you don't have to spend lots of money. You do a communication, and sometimes people are sensible to these type of communication and they act. What is the importance of eco-fiscal tools in Canada? Well, look at the graph here, and what is the data collected here? It's the OECD data, which means it's environmentally related tax and percentage of tax revenues for all levels of government in all the countries of OECD. And if we add all the revenues from these type of taxes, you see that Canada is really at the end of the graph, just before United States, which are the two countries where we use the last environmentally related taxes. This does not include fees and charges, so it's not a complete picture, but what we know is that it's not very popular in Canada. And I need to tell you something, that the year I use is 2021, and we add a carbon tax at that moment, a tax that we don't have anymore, except in Quebec. So we're probably worse than United States today. That's probably the picture we have right now. And I will leave the place to Fanny to explain you some more tools we used as eco-fiscal tools.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the invitation, Jean-Philippe, IMFG. So to understand the way local governments in Canada use eco-fiscal tools, we need like a common language because every province, the legislation for municipalities is different. So it varies according to every province. To make a long story short, we started getting interested in how in municipal eco-taxation when in Quebec, the provincial government gave all municipalities to impose general taxation and regulatory charge powers. And we looked at other municipalities across Canada, whether they had this power or not, and whether they were using it or not. So that's how we started to be interested in what was going on in other provinces. So before presenting the inventory of eco-fiscal measures in Canadian municipalities, I just wanted to have a common language with you. So the way local governments, generally speaking, in Canada are using their powers for eco-fiscal purposes, it's either a tax, a regulatory charge, or a user fee. The tax, it can be the general power. You have it in Toronto. We have in Quebec, the whole province. Also in in Manitoba. It's a general tax. The objective is just to levy revenues to fund local services. It needs to be a direct tax, and it doesn't need to be associated with jurisdictional powers. It can be a tax on basically anything. So it can be either general taxation power or a specific power like the vacant home tax, which is a specific legislation on vacant home tax, or the general power. The more specific taxes are more common. Then you have the regulatory charge. The regulatory charge has to be associated with a regulatory regime. So it needs to be in municipal field of jurisdiction, and it must focus on either two objectives. The most common one is to fund a regulatory regime, so a program, an infrastructure, a service. And the second type of regulatory charge is to change behavior. If the goal is the first one, to fund a program, service, infrastructure, the amount of the charge must be equivalent to the cost, like the development charge. If the goal is to change behavior, it can be discretionary, so that you can influence behavior. So that's, and I believe Quebec is the only province where municipalities can impose the general regulatory charge powers, so that they can impose a charge to influence behavior. And then the most common one is the user fee. Is the price tag for a service, a public service. So drink water charges or fees, waste management collection fee. So it's the most common tool that is used to fund and to change behavior. It's the user pay principle to partially fund municipal services that we all know. So the use of taxes, charges, and user fees, they can change behavior in two ways, either to disincentivize a behavior. So it can influence the behavior of the user sensitive to price tag, and just like the drink water charges or the waste collection charges, the more you consume, the more you pay, so it change behavior, or incentivize so that you can fund programs, services, or infrastructure that change behavior. So it works both ways. And it depends on the regime. So that's the inventory here. So the measures, so we classified the measures according to the type of power that is used. Is there a tax, a regulatory charge, or a user fee? And then the objective. So sustainable mobility, urban planning and development, air and greenhouse gas emissions, water, and waste material. So the measures in blue are only used in some Quebec municipalities. The measures in purple are studied in some Quebec municipalities. The measures in red are used outside of Quebec, in some municipalities outside of Quebec, and the measures in black are used in municipalities across Canada. The thing that you must know is that it's fairly anecdotal. So drink water fees, waste collections fees, they're more common, but the more innovative ones is just like one municipality. So it's not widely used, but it's very interesting for us, that are interested in that topic. So I'm gonna go through this table in less than 10 minutes. So I'm going to start with sustainable mobility. The first one is the motor vehicle registration tax. Quebec municipalities have the right to impose it since last year. Toronto has the right to impose it as well, but they don't, and the city doesn't. Yeah, this year it just got taken away because it's not popular. So it's tax not popular. So you know about it. Regulatory charge. Here you have three types. The regulatory charge on major trip generators is it would be regulatory charge on large employers so that it can adopt transportation management plan to incentivize large employers to adopt transportation management plans. It studies in one large municipality in Quebec. Development cost charges to fund a transit infrastructure. Like the REM, like TransLink, they have it as well. There are different models of imposing it, but all Quebec municipalities can impose it. And you have it here too. Regulatory charges on parcel delivery. It would be the companies who deliver the parcels that would be subject to the parcel delivery according to the amount of parcels delivered. So that's studied in one large municipality in Quebec, Montreal, not to say it. And then user fees tax for transit service. Sometimes municipalities fund transit service, their transit operators in the taxation bill yearly. It's not very nor common nor special. And then variable pricing or parking stickers. So that's just a type of user fee or a right to park, not very original. And then for urban planning and development, you have a tax on large parking spaces. A lot of municipalities in Quebec, they tax large parking spaces. You have a price for indoor or outdoor. You can generate $1 million and incentivize real estate development on those large commercial parking spaces. The floor area ratio tax, it's a tax for certain properties who don't meet a certain floor area ratio criteria. So commercial, industrial property with a floor area ratio of 2% and the target is 10, they're gonna pay a tax on the 8% missing. You convert it to square meter. So that can incentivize densification. It's adopted in 3 municipalities in Quebec. You have the vacant commercial property tax. It's similar to vacant tax, but for commercial property. 2 municipalities in Quebec. The no tree frontage tax. There was a municipalities, they had a regulation to have a tree in front of the house, but people were not complying. And it was really hard and they were contesting enforcement, they were contesting. So they got rid of the regulation and they're imposing a tax instead of having the regulation, which was difficult to enforce. Then vacant home tax, which we have it, we haven't applied it yet in Quebec, the vacant home tax, but we can do it. Then a regulatory charge for recultivating unused farmland. So if you have an owner of a farmland who is not registered at the Ministry of Agriculture, and he has a parcel of land that is, he hasn't used his property for 3 years or more, he gets a regulatory charge to incentivize cultivation and collect a fund for recultivate, funding young farmers. Regulatory charge for reduced canopy loss. So reduced canopy loss is to incentivize building permit requirement, like building permit applicant to keep a lot of the trees on the property. So it's $25 square foot meter of trees that are cut. So the property, the builder can keep a lot of trees on the property. Revitalization levies, so that's land value capture. We cannot do it in Quebec, but it's used in Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan. You cannot do it here because the regulation is not passed. The law is passed, but not the regulation to use it. Development charges, you know about them. In terms of air quality, you can do a taxation on oil heating appliances. So we do that in the city of Laval is doing it. So when it appears on the evaluation of the property, if there's an oil heating system, it's $100 per appliance. A charge to offset greenhouse gas emissions associated with real estate development. So when there's a permit applicant, he must pay $1.08 per square meter to fund the equivalent of the loss of biomass and the municipal works, the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the municipal works to prepare the land for development. You have this in Laval. For water, wastewater, stormwater charges, Mississauga, Kitchener, Victoria, to fund the stormwater infrastructure. So the amount of the charge is really equivalent to the cost of the infrastructure. And you have the same thing for drinking water as well. So you have either user fees or charges for drinking water. You need to have water meters, or sometimes so that it can vary according to the consumption. Then for residual materials, there's a city in Quebec who has a levy on single-use or individual containers. The property owner, the commercial property owner must report on the amount of single-use items sold or distributed every 3 months and pay for every single cup distributed or sold, water bottles, and it funds recycling services and etc. Then a regulatory charge on construction, renovation, demolition waste. It's to incentivize construction permit applicant to have a construction material waste management plan. So, so when you want to have to minimize the waste management material coming from construction site, you can have those type of plans with the charge. And then the pricing for the collection and treatment of residual materials is just waste charge on the amount of waste collected. So when you have the waste that is picked up, you have a chip on the large bin, and every collection that is more than once a month, you pay an extra fee for the pickup of the garbage. So this is the small inventory that we have. Does it work, Jean-Philippe? I'll let you answer the question.
Yeah, what do academic works says about eco-fiscal tools? Does it work? Yes, and there's no doubt about it. If you look at carbon taxes, I don't say that all studies conclude that, but most of the studies conclude that carbon tax reduces carbon emissions, they stimulate innovation and improve the environment. Usually they also stimulate the use of sustainable mobility. If you go to pricing drinking water, usually it helps to manage drinking water sustainably. Mainly in regions where you have some risk of water shortage. There you need pricing. And I'm not saying that water is a pollutant, but if you consume water, obviously you'll make some wastewater, and that's a pollutant. So pricing wastewater is exactly in the definition of eco-fiscal tools. Incentive-based pricing contribute to waste reduction, and it improves recycling also. And road pricing, and not only congestion charge. Here I talk about congestion charges because most of this academic studies on road pricing, they focus on congestion charges. And most of these studies conclude that it improves sustainable urban mobility, which means it reduces congestion, people will take more transit, and you'll have less pollution and less fine particles. So most of this, I will say that it works. Then what's the problem? Why are we not using it? And even when we use it, we think about retrieving that type of measure. Why? Well, two major points here, two major caveats. There will be more than two caveats, but two major. First one, the distributional effects, which means that even if the global impact of eco-fiscal measure is positive, which means that the society gain from these tools, there will always be winners and losers. Of course, if you're a big polluter, you don't win from eco-fiscal measures. Either you'll have to change your behavior, maybe you don't want, and you have to assume a cost of changing, or you'll pay the tax, which means that your production will be more expensive, or your consumption will be more expensive. So these losers, even though they lose less than what we gain, they can easily identify themselves, organize themselves, and produce type of information that will kill a carbon tax, for example. The other one is administrative cost. Some measures are very expensive to implement, and sometimes the cost of the measure will completely cancel the benefit of the tax. Some example of that. If you price water, of course, if you build all your water system on pricing, then it's not necessarily expensive to price water. If you look in Quebec, we don't have a tradition of water pricing in Quebec. So we have major cities like Montreal, they have nothing to measure the consumption of water. If you want to put meters on all households or housing units or commercial units, then the cost is very expensive. Of course, you will have a better management of your water infrastructure, but you'll have to pay a very high cost to get there. Same thing with road pricing. And we talk a lot about kilometric tax or kilometric charge, which is a very fancy, nice tool that we probably use one day, but it is expensive to implement. If you implement it, then it's not costly to use it, but to get there, you have to pay quite a high price. That's the end of what we had to say. I guess we'll have to sit right here and give the microphone to Ben. That's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, both, and thank you very much for giving me the chance to come here and speak on this topic, which I care a lot about. So it's a very timely, comprehensive overview of some of the eco-fiscal tools that are out there at the municipal level. It's very useful in terms of building a typology and investigating how environmental objectives fit into the fiscal system. So yes, eco-fiscal tools work. But the question that we're dealing with this month, this last year, is will they survive? And if so, how do they do so? So while the academic framing is very usefully grounded in Pigouvian logic and the double dividend hypothesis, there's value in some simplicity in how we talk about these things, and which is that at the ground level, at the municipal level, what these are is really just a pragmatic effort to keep property taxes down. And that's the case where there's no other alternative in how we pay for them. That's like water fees and waste, which we'll get into. But when there are alternatives, like just polluting or sitting in traffic, that's when the battle is much, much harder. So I'll try to cover a few reflections on the paper. First of all, what eco-fiscal really is, the double dividend, how do you deal with that? How the end of fuel taxes, I think, fits into this. And Fanny mentioned this issue in Laval of value charge, THC charge on land development. There's something to unpack in that I want to hear more about. So first of all, when is eco-fiscal really just user pay? So the authors frame water pricing, stormwater management, and waste charges as eco-fiscal tools, and they're right. But politically, these just are not talked about as green taxes. They're cost recovery mechanisms. And in Ontario, these services have been overwhelmingly financed by user fees. And what makes them work isn't the environmental ambition. It's the desire to keep property taxes down. And that should be, in my opinion, the default framing for as much of this as possible. Because it makes it very clear that there's a benefit cost relationship. And it is precisely in the areas where the link is weaker, roads, land use, or emissions, where the eco-fiscal politics get more complex. And development charges, to me, epitomize this. Their political durability, as they've gone up substantially, doesn't come from any conversations about deterring sprawl. It's because the alternative is much higher property taxes or higher water fees, for example. And so the same applies to a lot of the potential tools out there. And the link to emissions, for example, in the world that I work on right now, is that the direction of travel and talking about these charges isn't about the environmental impact, but it's about the opportunity of investing in creating low carbon or low emission jobs in technology of the future. That's the potential benefit that we get as Canadians in being leaders in this area and not being left behind. I don't want to talk about the emissions necessarily as much, depending on the audience. The other point that comes into play is the double dividend. And it's nice in theory, but it's politically fraught in practice. The redistribution is very, very real. The redistribution effects are very real. So those who are feeling the price, feeling the harm of the eco-fiscal or their wallet of the eco-fiscal taxes, they feel it, they see it, And those who benefit, say through slightly lower property taxes, it's less evident to them. We need to pull out all the stops in terms of making, when we want to preserve an eco-fiscal tax, to make clear those benefits. To me, one example just jumps out right away, which is that it was only up until sometime last year where we would have all gotten your Canadian carbon rebate. It was only last year where that actually became clear in your bank statements that is your rebate. That's the sort of thing that was a necessary element if we were going to have any chance of keeping the carbon tax, but that didn't get done, and here we are. So the question, so that's just one example, but the couple other ideas in terms of the other parts of eco-fiscal tools that are out there that we might want to get into is like road tolls, road pricing. You know, here we are the week after this, the province has removed even the possibility of the city of Toronto asking for introducing a road toll. We also have in New York lots of debates right now between the city of New York and the Trump administration in terms of it being allowed. So I argue that in terms of talking about road pricing as a toll or a charge, we're further behind than we ever were. Maybe. So here's another idea. Let's not talk about it in the language of taxes. And we'll give you an example. We talked about Quebec. Quebec has a carbon pricing system. It's not called a tax. But let's talk about Calgary. Calgary has a congestion price. You didn't know that because it's not a congestion price. What it is, it's a cap on the number of parking spaces downtown. It's like a cap and trade system. The government doesn't get a dime from the system. The benefits accrue to the people who happen to have parking spaces, but it has the same economic outcome, which is that it's very expensive to drive and park downtown. Sounds like a good congestion charge to me. But the question becomes, how do we talk about it? How is it framed? It doesn't have any of the politics of looking like a charge, government revenues that create surplus problems where people want to look at that and say, we should cut that or read it or have a concern about that. So I think this eco-fiscal discussion should be thinking a little bit beyond taxes and tolls, language that just creates is like a red flag to a bull in the modern fights, but think about the same economic outcome. What's the goal that we're trying to get at? And again, I talked about the Quebec cap and trade system as having survived. And well, I guess what I'll close up on is an example of, we talked about when is an eco-fiscal tool a really good instrument. It's in contrast to a strict regulatory charge. And you talk about emissions, for example, we're going to have to emit tomorrow in some capacity. The other example I'll use is on land use. We need to grow. We need to grow up, we need to grow out in order to facilitate a growing Canadian population. But what we have in Ontario land use, municipal land use, isn't an eco-fiscal approach, it's a pretty strict regulatory approach. I can give you a couple examples. The Greenbelt's one specific example. Thou shalt not grow in the Greenbelt. The political cost of that is one thing. But then you get into other approaches of expanding the urban growth boundary. That's less controversial, but it's still a regulatory approach. It's a very strict approach. And what we do in a lot of these debates is we impart some value of greenhouse gases, of the environmental impact of that. But there's no price on it. There's no number that people have thought about. So this idea that you've come up with, or what's going on coming up in Laval, I'm glad to heard the city that this is happening in. There's something to unpack in that. That can potentially be a way in which we change the debate, change the conversation about land use and how to apply an eco-fiscal tool as opposed to a strict regulatory approach. So I'd lean into that in your work. So for example, you've got examples in there of like what the dollar figure is on a square meter basis, but make that real for people. What is this really going to mean in terms of revenue, in terms of the impact of the house? Because I really think that there's some value there, and that would really drive the debate forward of a tangible way to apply an eco-fiscal approach in a way that we really need it compared to a strict regulatory approach that we have now. So with that, I'll say that, again, the paper is a very valuable contribution to the eco-fiscal conversation, especially with the municipal sector. So thank you very much for doing it, and thanks for letting me give you some of my reflections on it.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to the three of you. That's a great discussion. We do have time for questions if anyone has a question. Sure. Oh, just a second. Hold on one sec, please. Because we're live streaming, we need to.
This is not on. Is it? Hello? Oh,
Yeah,
you can hear me now.
working now.
I'm a registered professional planner in Ontario and in Quebec, and I was really fascinated to see some of these examples. I'm curious to hear, and I think you alluded to this, Ben, about how do you build buy-in? There seems like the environmental movement's losing some buy-in on these fees, and in particular, I'd be curious to know but the no tree frontage tax, how do they build buy-in for that, if you happen to know? And if you don't, that's okay. But just in general, what are thoughts about building buy-in for these fees, prices, whatever you want to call them?
Veux-tu que je réponde? An instrument like an eco-fiscal tool never comes alone. You need a communication and you have to quantify the benefits and also tell the people how you're going to spend money, the money that is collected. In the case of Prévost, which is the fee on single-use items, they really had a whole communication campaign, a website, as well as the obligation for the business owner to provide vrac, en vrac, comment on dit ça? Some items in bulk prior to the regulatory charge on items. So it comes with a package. That would be my answer. And in the case of the no tree frontage tax, the way that they frame it, they said it's cheaper than enforcing the regulation. It's simpler. So it's going to be better for the taxpayer in the long run. And last thing, sometimes you never know what's going to be the reaction. Sometimes they impose a tax on large commercial parking spaces. There's no one says anything, and sometimes they impose a tax on the pool and it's like the end of the world, so you never know what's going to be the public reaction to it.
So we've been talking about commercial parking levies here in Toronto, and it's quite a controversial topic and it's not going ahead. There's a question here.
Yes, thank you. I'm a little confused about Ben's last point. Maybe you could explain it. So you pointed out that development is very strictly regulated. Good example is don't build on the green belt, follow the official plan. What were you suggesting as the alternative that was less regulatorily constraining? Was it? I didn't quite catch that.
The authors have covered this. This is something that they've pointed out in their paper. So
okay, well, maybe I'm asking wrong people then. So what is the alternative to strict regulation, say to reduce sprawl or whatever?
Right. Well, if you just take mobility, the problem with sprawl is that transportation is too cheap. You don't tax transportation the right amount. And if you put in place gas tax or fuel taxes, they do exist. And I know that Canadian thing that we pay lots of taxes here or lots of fuel taxes because it's twice what we find in some states in the United States, but it's 1/3 of what we see in Europe and most Asian countries. And why do you have less sprawl in Europe and Asia? Well, the fuel tax is one of the answer. It's not the answer, it's one of the answer. And if you put in place a kilometric tax, then you don't necessarily need a green belt. You can want a green belt as well. I say usually you do both. You need parks, you need green space. You'll have some space that there's an endangered species in some places. And if you have endangered species, then you blocked it. You put some coercive measure. That's what you want to do. But if it's just sprawl, then tax mobility, and then people will go less further because it will be too expensive to sprawl. And that's the problem we have here in Canada. It's too cheap to drive.
But weren't you also, Ben, referring to the redevelopment levy that they were talking about?
No, I'm thinking about it's something that you mentioned in the paper where the idea is if there's land that you convert, greenfield land that you convert into housing, rather than just have a assume that there's an environmental cost to that we just don't quantify. We just a lot of the approaches to say don't develop at all on greenfield land. That's then too high of a cost. The eco-fiscal tools allow you to identify what is the real cost to society of our decision, whether it's driving 1 kilometer in an internal combustion vehicle, whether it's a kilowatt hour of electricity from a natural gas power plant, or a barrel of oil from the oil sands. All these things have an economic benefit, and an eco-fiscal tool allows you to equate that to society-wide to a cost. And there's a cost of not developing land. And this tool, putting a price on it, can help us have a better conversation about it rather than just blanket bans on developments in some places.
We have 2 types of charge to do that. There's the Laval one, is the greenhouse gas emissions associated with development. Yeah, so it's the loss of biomass and the greenhouse gas emissions associated with municipal construction works. So they converted that, and it's $1.08 per square meter. And in Victoriaville, it's when there's a permit requirement and they send the plans. They look at the number of trees that are going to be cut, and it's $25 per square meter of tree cut. But the thing is, if it was the ecological value of trees, it's very high. It's like more than $300 per square meter. So you cannot impose. It's too high. So the politicians they decreased it to $25. Because if you do it the real price, it would be not acceptable for the people.
Those are helpful examples. Thank you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sure, Zach and then Dina.
Thanks for your presentation. I was interested in the specific example of the charge for emissions associated with real estate development, specifically the municipal works associated with real estate development. Could you just talk a bit more about that example in terms of how well received it was by the community, how well, if there was a perceived impact on housing supply and housing prices, or if you just give a bit more context?
Yeah, the amount, like the dollar per square meter, it's so low that it was widely accepted. The greenhouse gas emissions associated with the municipal construction works, it's only like the water, sewer. So it's a small part that was easy to measure for the municipalities, and they conducted a study, and they validated the study by Equiterre, which is a nonprofit organization, to get some backup for that. And then with that, they funded at the beginning, they funded subsidies for electric bicycles, electric vehicles, and collection of old refrigerators and stuff like that. And then with the time, they reduced the amount of subsidies, like the vehicle subsidies. They abandoned it, but they kept the electric bicycle and all that. So it's not even an issue. Like, no one is talking about it. And it's been there since 2010, and it's very accepted. It's not known.
So I think that there's so much to unpack in this charge, because I've been part of the conversations about, should we have policies that expand urban development by this much or that much? And a huge component of the case on one side is the greenhouse gas impact. No one's told me what that is, and we're just guessing. And so a charge that really puts a number on that, and makes it clear what the environmental component of that is, embeds that price. And then we can continue on with our conversation about, all right, now let's talk about other things. We've covered that cost, we've covered the environmental component. What else is all part of the decision about expanding our urban growth boundary?
Dina over here, and then at the back.
Thanks. I was intrigued by the tax on parcel delivery. And I was intrigued by it because it seems to me, at least here in Toronto, and I'm not sure about the other municipalities across the country, that we see increasing numbers of parcels being delivered either by e-bike or by electric vehicles. And I was just curious to know how, in a way that's good, right? It means it's working potentially, but I was just curious to know a little bit more about it. Is it only applied to fossil fuel burning? Like, how do you figure out who to tax in a parcel delivery scheme?
You need to start with a permit system so that you have knowledge of the amount of parcels delivered, with which vehicles, and plus the deliveries are becoming more and more efficient. Like the routes are efficient, the vehicles are electric. So the way that you can justify the charge would be the treatment of recycling all the boxes and the impact as well on local roads and local businesses. So you can fund tax rebates for smaller businesses that are in older commercial areas. So that's the logic, but you need the information first, and to get the information, you need a permit system. That's how they would go about it if they decide to go about it.
Okay, there's okay, the lady there.
Hi, Ana Gonzalez. I think just generally we've been focusing on mitigation, just policy regulation, a lot of just trying to reduce GHGs. I do recognize that an eco-fiscal tool is an eco-fiscal tool, but I'm wondering if, to your point, because we have to price, or we're internalizing the externality and pricing something that's already happening, with adaptation and resilience, we're really anticipating a cost that hasn't happened. And we can guess that it will be, but we don't know the exact cost of the impacts of climate change in certain areas. So I'm wondering if you've seen examples of eco-fiscal tools applied to adaptation and resilience measures, not just in the where the money goes to, but in how it's integrated or even set up.
Well, we worked on adaptation tools, but it's not necessarily clear how we will adapt. If we have a better preservation of natural areas, then it will be easier to adapt. If we take parking lots, for example, parking lots are heat area. They will probably increase the problem of flowing water into wastewater and installation. There's lots of externalities with parking lots, and if we change these parking lots to something that will adapt more to the future, plant trees, reduce the space of parking lots, not using the car. These are all behavior that will help us adapt to the future. And the tool is very simple at the beginning. Just tax the area of the parking area on the size of the parking area, put a tax on it. And the tool is very easy. And you don't necessarily have to measure if it's really fits all the externalities. You know that there are lots of externalities. We don't necessarily have a fine measure of the cost of each externality. We don't necessarily have a fine measure of the cost of green gas emission, because green gas emission will bring global warming, and global warming will bring some environmental consequences in the future and maybe in other countries, not necessarily here. It's really hard to measure, but as long as you know that there are externalities somewhere, and if you tax, then you'll have an impact. And it's really hard to implement eco-fiscal tools on externalities that we don't feel. If we have no local consequences, then why should we tax it? And that's the problem with carbon tax. We don't feel the consequences. It's easier with water, because if your water, your potable water is polluted and you cannot drink any water, or the cost of getting water is getting higher and higher and higher, because you need to dig deeper and deeper, or to go further and further to take your water, then you know that the water has a price, and you want to pay to preserve your resources because you feel it. And that's why if you look at the spectra of eco-fiscal tools, some tools are quite widely accepted and probably implemented in lots of places because the problem is local. And the more you go to global problems, then the more you have debates. Well, I don't feel the global warming. And in Canada, it's cold. So I would like Canada to warm up a little bit. So I'm having fun with it. And I don't care about the fact that an island in the middle of Pacific Ocean will be submerged with water. I don't feel any pain for that. So that's, if you go with global problems, then you have to find global solutions, and we are very bad at applying global solutions. And if you go with heat islands, then heat islands, it's hot and you feel it's hot. And probably you don't want to have lots of heat islands in Toronto, for example, then you'll fight against it, and the neighborhood will be with you, and then you'll put policies on, and people will back your policy because the externality is local. And that's a major problem. And that's why we have some eco-fiscal tools that are popular or well accepted and others that are not.
Good. We have time for one more question. Did you forfeit your question?
Yeah, you know what, yeah.
Okay.
That's the kind of guy. Sure. No worries.
All right. I'm Ian. I work with Durham Region. So maybe a couple of comments. So it sounds like it's more viable when there's revenue recycling. So there's a constituency that benefits at the end of the day, but also maybe when it's like cast as like a polluter, big polluter pays. It sounds like this idea of big polluters paying is getting more traction, at least with the carbon pricing federally, but also locally with commercial parking taxes and things like that. So I guess, are you seeing that a lot more where like tools are more tenable or have more buy-in when it's big corporate entities that are facing the tax, and then the beneficiaries are, say, more on the residential side, like the property taxpayers? I'm thinking in the context of like a stormwater management fee where you're taxing big box parking lots and the revenues are being used to fund tree planting or like, you know, things like that. Is that sort of bearing out in your research that those sort of themes are true?
So maybe I could give one point on the industrial carbon price. How it actually works is a good chunk of the companies out there actually make money off the system. The way it works is a benchmark, and then companies that are above the benchmark in terms of emissions intensity pay more, but the ones below that benchmark make money by paying, having the companies with a higher intensity pay them for credits. So you created a constituency that wants the system to survive. And the government gets relatively little money from that. That's another key component of that. So it's more complicated in terms of the industrial pricing system surviving because of the politics of that. A lot of companies see a direct financial benefit from the industrial pricing system.
Last word to our authors.
Well, obviously, firms, enterprise, or commercial property, they don't vote. So it's easier if you point these guys to implement your policy. Of course, it is. So yes, we don't necessarily have research on that point, but obviously, since they don't vote, it's easier. And some people think that eco-fiscal tools are unfair because they change the rules in the middle of the game. If you buy a big car, you buy a big home in a suburb, and that's your way of life. And then I change the rules in the middle of the game, and I say, well, now you don't pay on the value of your property, you pay on the size of your car and the distance you make to go to work. And then these people think it's unfair because you change the rules in the middle of the game. And that's the point where it's very hard to implement new fiscal tools, not only eco-fiscal tools, any kind of new fiscal tools is hard to implement because you change the rules. If you have a very large base and everybody think that they all lose together, it's easier than if you have losers and winners. Losing all together sometimes, people that get rid of the carbon tax, lots of households were receiving payment for that. They're all losers. And sometimes they don't care because they
don't know.
They don't know. But they thought the tax was not unfair because it was not applied on equally to everyone. And they think that they might pay more taxes on consumption or on revenues, but at least they think everybody paid these taxes.
So I think we're going to have to draw to a close, if that's okay. I can see we're a small group, but lots of questions and lots to talk about. I know I have found this fascinating, and we haven't even gotten into the whole area of other taxes and fees that affect the environment that are not necessarily designed to, like the property tax. If we tax apartments at a higher rate than single-family homes, as we do, then we are providing a disincentive to density. Or the development charges. If we charge all developers the same amount, whether they're close to existing services or further away from existing services, we're having an impact on sprawl. So even our non-eco-fiscal tools that we use to pay for services in municipalities are affecting the environment. And as I say, we haven't even gotten to that, but this has been a great discussion. I want to thank Jean-Philippe, Fanny, and Ben for a terrific discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I just want to say lastly that the slides that were up here today will be on our website. So if you missed something, particularly that chart, you can look at the slides. And Jean-Philippe and Fanny have written a paper on eco-fiscal tools, which we will be publishing through our IMFG paper series, but that will come out a little bit later on once it's finished. But that will be available on our website as well. Thanks everyone for coming.
Congratulations.